It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Frank Yates, an Arthur Thoreau professor, professor of psychology, professor of marketing and business administration at the University of Michigan. He has a very interesting role in also being the principal in the psychology department's judgment and decision laboratory. He's the coordinator of the Decision Consortium, which is a University of Michigan-wide association of faculty and students, and we are very pleased to have him with us today.
Can you hear me? Is this okay? All right, well, thank you very much for the introduction and for the opportunity to participate in this activity, which I've for years admired from a distance. So when I read Professor Grimshaw's statistics, I was really struck by these. The first one is that 30 to 40% of patients who go in to be seen for some condition get treatments that are not of proven effectiveness. And the second statistic is just as disturbing, that you might in fact get the wrong thing, something that's not needed, or it might in fact be harmful. What do you think about, how should you think about this? I'm like the guy who's shown here. So the proverbial boy with a hammer. To him, everything looks like a nail. To me, I'm a decision guy. So I think of everything in life as entailing decisions, including Professor Grimshaw's remarks. And so I'm going to talk about these issues from the perspective of decision science or decision scholarship more generally. So first of all, the statistics that he quoted, those 20s and 30% and the like, suggest to me high rates of deficient or ineffective decisions. That then leads to a couple of challenges in my mind and the minds of people who hang out with those of us in the decision field. The first is explanation. You see a puzzle there. How can you explain the decisions that people are making that result in the kinds of statistics that Professor Grimshaw quoted? And then the second is facilitation. So to the extent that you have somebody who's making decisions that arguably are not so hot, how can you get them to do things differently? And I'm citing Professor Grimshaw again here because, if you will recall, further along in his talk, he suggested an approach to the broader notion of implementation consistent with this view that those of us in decision research hold: the explanation, perspective, and facilitation. So he suggested that if you really want to change people's behavior, then it's in your interest to understand why they're behaving the way they do in the first place. And that leads you into, you might say, more intelligent and ultimately more successful ways of changing the behavior. So that's the strategy, or the idea here. Now, who is this guy here? This is John Isner. He's currently the top-ranked American tennis player, singles player in the U.S., but that's only 10th in the world. But you know, the country's down for about the last decade or so, but they'll come back. So what's the point here? What is he doing? He's hitting a forehand. So let's imagine that you're a tennis player, or if you're not yet a tennis player, and you want to hit forehands at all or better. You go to see your coach, and your coach is, in essence, going to be a facilitator who is going to try to bring to bear all the science of hitting forehands that has developed over the last century and a half. And so I'm going to take that as an analogy for the kind of analysis that I'm going to talk about having to do with decision making. So this is a way that you might characterize what happens with the forehand. At the top, you have the objective, which is to win matches rather than lose them. Now, that's going to be a function of how you hit forehands, as well as other factors, including who you're playing. Now, what about the nature of a forehand? So if you're a coach, you are not going in you might say, completely naive about how people hit forehands. You're relying on, you might say, synthesized knowledge over many decades, and entailed in hitting a forehand are things that everybody has to do. You have to have a stance, you have to have a grip, you have to transfer weight, you have to have a gaze, and underneath those things there are determinants of how you go about those things. So let's suppose that John Isner is having trouble with his forehand. He goes to see his favorite coach, and so the coach knows where to look. Where might the problems actually lie? And she might identify those things, and that then points the way toward remedies to Isner's current problems. Now, let's talk about this being specialized to the domain of decision making. So what I want to do is to describe, you might say, a way of viewing decision making in general. And so I want to talk about basics, and then I want to specialize it to the discussion to the kinds of things that are of interest here. First of all, getting most basic, what do we mean by a decision? A decision is a commitment to a course of action that has a particular intent. It's intended to serve the interests and values of particular people, which very inelegantly I describe as intended beneficiaries. This is not going to be a talk about insurance, so don't get worried. I'm not trying to sell that to you. Maybe other things, but not insurance. Now, there are several critical elements here, not the least of which is that it's about interests and values of particular people. It's not about people in general. Decision-making is a special case of problem solving. So the kinds of problems we're concerned about are distinctive, particularly with regard to value. What's in a satisfactory decision for one person is not necessarily for another person. Otherwise, you'd have everybody trying to buy the same cars, trying to marry the same people, things of that sort, and that doesn't happen. So if you need something to anchor you in the discussion, think about buying a house. Probably most people in this room at some point or another have been involved with that. Or you could consider things like, if you are a doc, making a recommendation about how to deal with a patient's prostate cancer. Now, it's useful to distinguish two classes of decisions in discussions like this. First of all, policy decisions, and then you have on-the-spot decisions. So a policy decision is, in essence, a decision in which a person is trying to arrive at this conclusion. This is how I will approach this class of decision. On the other hand, an on-the-spot decision has to do with how you make a specific decision. So take the case of our doc dealing with prostate cancer. So the policy decision will have to do with him saying, this is how I think I want to go about making this class of decision, and on-the-spot treatment decision would have to do with a given patient. Now, before we proceed further, it's important to think about what it means to say that a decision is effective or is not effective, or in the vernacular, which most of us avoid with good reason, good as opposed to bad decisions, because it's a loaded term. The key point here is that decisions in terms of their quality need to be distinguished in terms of what they produce, which was the original intent. So if you're talking about a patient, you would want to get rid of the cancer, or you want to prevent or forestall death. The other part has to do with decision process costs and or benefits. People generally tend to focus only on the outcomes per se, but in many contexts, including medicine as well as business, people are going to be very seriously concerned about costs. There are two kinds of costs we normally think about, costs and benefits. One are material ones, which entail money, time, things of that sort. The other broadly would be psychological. So if you think about it for about a couple of minutes, you'll recognize that your decisions often are problematic in terms of the stress they tend to induce, which is often tied to uncertainty. There can even be interpersonal discord, particularly in business situations or governmental situations where people have different thoughts as to what ought to be done. Now, people also talk about the gains in terms of process, that decision-making can be beneficial in terms of what people learn. So that's one of the reasons you would, for instance, include junior people in serious decision deliberations. The expectation is that there will be a benefit for future decisions down the pike. And then I highlighted autonomy on the screen as well, because that has been a major concern within the medical decision community, even to the point where some people will say that the ultimate criterion as to the quality of medical decision making has to do with the autonomy of the patient. I happen to disagree with that to a degree, to a point, but it's out there.